I won't mind. So yeah, let's get started. So I work at a company called Industrial, and we're kind of like an agency. We kind of like have a product on one hand, and we have a lot of like client applications on the other hand. So I was working on one of the last sort of like client projects that I had. It was basically like a lot of forms. That was kind of what I had to do. It was just like form after form after form. It was just a giant survey. So that's kind of what led me down this path to think about form objects. And if you kind of think about that problem, like it's kind of easy problem if your data matches what's on your form. But it gets like a little bit trickier if that's not the case. So you kind of like have things like accepts nested attributes for in Rails, and that is kind of what you need, and it just kind of sort of works if your data matches your form. And there's lots of like other things you can do as well. So if it's not the case that your data is not matching your form, there's lots of other things you can do. So you can one example is like storing data in a session. I don't know if you guys have ever done that before, but it's okay. There's another gem called Wicked out there. Maybe you've heard of it. And the idea behind Wicked is it'll kind of separate out your form. If you have to do multiple forms, like many forms, one after the other, it'll kind of separate that out and keep it all in one controller, which is okay. And then another thing you can do is state machines, and kind of what I'm talking about is once your forms get to this level of complexity where you maybe have a wizard, you have to run through numerous steps, and you need to maybe validate a bunch of stuff along the way before you can actually submit the form and do it. So and another way that I heard is nested models, where you essentially segment out your model into different chunks, and you validate each chunk separately, and kind of go from there. So for me, I'm not like a huge fan of any of those approaches, and kind of the reason why is we're bending our view onto the model. And everybody sort of says, you know, don't put your model in your view, but nobody ever says like, don't put your view in your model. And so that's kind of what I don't want to do. So let's not do it. And there's a really good alternative, and it's called a form object. And it's pretty simple, like what a form object is. All it means is it's kind of the thing that you're passing form 4 into. So this is like a standard example, you know, like everybody's seen this type of code before. You're just like passing a person into the form, and then you have a name and a submit button. It's like really simple. And that could be a form object. It could not be. It might not be like this person instance variable. It could be a form object. It could just be like an active record model. It doesn't really matter what we kind of pass into form 4, and that's kind of the basic idea behind a form object. So for this talk, like I'm going to just use an example. It's kind of like an arbitrary example. Before I became a developer, I was a dog walker, and had a dog walking company, and I built a little application so I could like bill and charge my clients, and I learned how to develop like doing that. And so this is an example. So let's say you have your dog walking service, and you need to fill in like your company name, your phone number, and this is kind of like just like the onboarding process before you can, just imagine it's like the onboarding before you can actually get access to the account. So you maybe like you'd sign in, and then you'd go through this process to kind of set up the application. The second step here is we're filling in an address, and we can add multiple addresses. We can delete addresses before we save and continue those. And the last one is a profile, where it's just sort of like our name, maybe like the size of our business, the type of subscription we belong to, our time zone language. Like, these are kind of like arbitrary examples, but what's kind of interesting about them is kind of the data model here, which is what makes it tricky. So in our first form that we're going to build here, we're dealing with the problem of nested data. So in this, we have a company and a phone models, like both in the same form. Pretty simple. The second one, it's all the same model, but we're adding and removing stuff, and it's just sort of like this custom logic of adding and removing different addresses in the same form. And then the third form is our data is like scattered all over, and the kind of the tricky part with this is we're revalidating company. So imagine that we're validating everything as we go along. We've already validated company and a name. Now we have to validate time zone and kind, and we also have these other models to contend with and submit data at the same time. So it's kind of a trivial example, but it kind of speaks to larger problems that I've encountered building forms and how to sort of deal with that. So let's start off with our first form. And we don't need to study this code like too closely. Like it's pretty simple. Like the only thing that worth kind of pointing out here is this: we're passing in our company form, which is an object, into here, and we're passing in company params, which is down here. And those params, we're just passing in the company, the name, and the number. Okay, and you notice that these things here are kind of flat. There's no, we're not like doing that weird nested thing. Like, I forget the syntax behind with it when you have to like nest something with accepts nested attributes for. We're not doing that. It's just like flat attributes. Keeps it kind of simple. And for the form itself, we're passing in that instance variable, so that company form.new, we're just passing that into our form here. And just our name and number. It's really simple. And you'll notice again, these are flat. We're not nesting these in any way with like fields for or anything like that. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it two ways for this form. The first way, we're just going to roll our own form object, and we're just going to use kind of the things that Rails gives us. And after that, we're going to refactor that, and we'll set it up with a gem called reform. So I'll show you how this goes. So the first thing we do is we include active model. That'll give us validation and things like translations and stuff like that. We define attribute accessors for our name and our number. Then we have to kind of set like where these objects are coming from. So we define company and we define phone, and we kind of like just build those objects in memory for this with the attributes that we want. Then we add in our validation. So and for this example, I'm just using presence validation, but you can imagine that there might be some more complex logic around validation and things like that. It doesn't really matter, because you can just sort of validate everything in the form object, no matter how simple or how complex it is. And you notice there's this validate company and phone, which right here. And all of this is doing, the reason we need to write this is we need to just display the errors that may come up. And this display errors message here, like we have to write this because phone is nested under company. So company has many phones, and to display nested errors, we have to then bubble them up to the parent attribute, which is company. And so that's all that this is doing, is we're just bubbling up those error messages of any nested data models. And then then the other thing we have to do is we have to kind of like pretend that this is a company, essentially, like a company model. It'll kind of act the same way as if you were to instantiate a company controller or something like that, just with this little method here. And then we have to write a save method. So it just checks if it's valid, and it's wrapped. Everything's wrapped inside of a transaction block, and company and phone both have bang methods on them. So if for whatever reason one of those fails and can't save, like everything will be rolled back. Yeah, that's what I said. So, and the last sort of thing that we need to do is we back in our controller here, just to redirect to the next form and the next controller, we just need our company ID that we just created for that company. So we'll just define that on here, and I'll just use a delegate to do that. So that's kind of an example of how to do a quick form object. And this is all just like rolling our own, just giving us what Rails gives us. And I'm going to go through it and talk about reform. So reform is a gem. It comes from Trailblazer. I don't know if anybody's heard of Trailblazer before, but it's a pretty interesting way of rethinking Rails, I would say. Like what it is it's just a way of so Rails is like you know, like all MVC model view controller, and Trailblazer says like, no, that's not enough. We need to organize our code in a very different way. And so it just sort of builds an extension on top of Rails, and you can do these things called sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but essentially it allows you to just sort of separate your code into these like service objects, pretty much. And those service objects can then just have like very specific behavior to what they do. And like reform is like is one of those things where its specific behavior is just to build forms, and that's its whole purpose. So sorry, did anybody have a question or anything?
No, I was just thinking that, were you thinking of value objects? Is that the name?
No, it's something else. I can't remember. I'll think of it in a second.
No problem.
I know there's contracts in Trailblazer.
Yeah, I don't know. Trailblazer is like super dense. There's like lots of stuff going on in there, so there's lots of moving parts. But maybe called like operations or something. I can't remember. Anyway, doesn't matter.
I think they're operations too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to refactor this, like, the first thing we need to do is we just need to inherit from reform form. So, and that's going to give us lots and lots of behavior that we don't that we can just get rid of now. So things like include active model. Reform doesn't really care about Rails or anything like that, so we don't need that stuff. We're going to do something similar to setting accessors. It's going to be called a different syntax, and they're going to be called properties. So it's the same thing. We can just define properties, and we can just write to them after that. This model name we're not going to need anymore. And on our form, it's going to be like a little bit different. So reform does it a bit differently, where we have to actually pass in the model that we're writing to or changing. So in this case, it's company.new, and that means that this can get rid of that. Does the same thing. So now we're just defining the company on the controller, and the form can now read that company from inside here. We don't need this delegate anymore. What else are we doing here? So all the validation. I think I'm going to talk about that a bit later, but we're just going to get rid of that for now. And right, so we just need to define our company. Like before, we've sort of defined it on the in the form object here, but we define it on the controller now, so we can get rid of that. And company.phones, we're going to do something a little bit different to define that, and it's called a collection. So basically, nested objects in reform are going to be called collections. And we just can define as many collections as we want. We can define collections within collections if we have nested within nested objects. And we just like add in our property number into there. And that's that. One thing that's different in our view here is we have we can no longer use this like flat view. So when you do a collection in Reform, you kind of need to do the fields for in your view. And so that's pretty standard stuff. We don't need to write our own save method anymore, which is really nice. We can get rid of that. Reform is going to handle that for us. Sorry, I need some water. Can somebody remind me what those are called at the bottom there of the controller?
Strong parameters.
Yeah, strong parameters, right. So you don't need strong parameters anymore. Like the nice thing about Reform is all of your properties that you define are going to be basically the same as strong parameters. Like if you can't add anything besides like the properties that you define. So this is very safe to remove, which is nice. You don't have to deal with that anymore. We just pass in our company and that's it. So the one difference here, our controller, we're calling like save on the controller here before, but Reform handles it a little bit differently. So what we do is we call validate before we save it. We pass in our parameters that the form is giving us, that like the user is submitting and all that stuff, and then we save it. So that's pretty much it. But then you'll notice like, okay, yeah. So it's been like a little bit of time since I've given this talk, so I'm like kind of remembering it. I don't have my notes in front of me, but essentially like you kind of run into a problem like doing this. The phone suddenly like disappears from here, and there's a reason for it, and you kind of have to do. It's kind of like if you call .new but you don't build the thing, it just sort of disappears. That's what's happening. And you can do something like this where you define your company and you build the phones and that'll work. Or you can use a method called pre-populate, and that's a Reform method. And it's pretty easy. You just, there's a couple ways you can do this, but like you can just use this pre-populator, you build the phone, and you just define it here. And phones matches your collection, and you just append phone.new onto it if it's blank, and that's it. So pretty simple stuff, and then that works. The next thing is this primary true flag here, and we're going to deal with that in a second. But we can get rid of this phone because that's handled by our collection now. So our class is getting a lot smaller, as you can see, as we're going here. And our property primary, let's add that in here. Default true, and that should work just like that. So there's a couple things in Reform. There's kind of like these two things. There's a thing called like a pre-populator and a populator. If you think about it, like pre-populators are your new and edit actions. They're called manually inside your controller when you call .prepopulate on something, and they're what prepares the form for rendering. And you can also like pre-fill in like form fields if you want, stuff like that. Populators, you can think about it as more the create and update methods. And they're called every time you call .validate. And they're the kind of thing that prepares the form for validation. And they care more about matching the right data to the right model. So we're going to need that for our phone here. And the idea is sorry, I forgot to mention that that the phone model actually wasn't saving. So this is why we're doing this. Is you essentially have to like just say like, hey, this collection called phones, it matches up to this model called phone. And Reform like it isn't really smart enough, or maybe it's probably like smart enough if it wanted to be, but I think it mostly just doesn't like care about Rails. It just sort of like, yeah, you guys define the data that you pass into here. Any sort of like nested data you just need to define. And so the easiest way is to do is populate if empty, and you just pass in your model there. And then we add in some validation. So you can use sort of two options with Reform. There's just the standard Rails validation, which is what I'm using in this example. They also prefer a gem called dry validation. And that's a really nice gem. It's a little bit of a learning curve, but it's really pleasant to work with once you get going. But for this example, I'm just going to keep it with the standard, the Rails validations here. Okay, so that's our first form. Like pretty simple stuff. You know, we're just doing two fields. There's a lot going on though. So that's kind of comparison. Like the roll our own is on the left, the Reform form is on the right, and you can obviously see that there's way less code to write in the Reform form. And the reason is we don't have to write our own save method. We don't have to bubble up validations. We don't have to do a lot of stuff that we'd have to like manually do and figure out on our own. Reform is nice in that there's just gives you a lot of stuff for free, and once you know the syntax, it's really quite pleasant to work with. And in our controller, they're like a little bit different. So again, roll our own is on the left, Reform on the right. You can see that, we're calling pre-populate on things, and we're wrapping everything in a validate block. On the Reform side, I kind of like the syntax on the left of like if company form dot save, but I don't know. I think this is kind of a wash. You don't have to do strong params, which is nice as well. So let's move on to the second form. Again, we're just like making an address, and we can add and remove multiple addresses here. And again, we just make a new object called address form, and we're just passing our company, which is the parent object for this. So a company can have many addresses, and we call pre-populate on it. And in our form, what we're going to do here, I'm using simple form for this, but form 4 works really well as well. Doesn't matter. We just have fields for addresses, and sorry, there's yeah, and that just has like our field set, which has our address, city, state, zip, country code. There's a link to remove fields, a hidden field to destroy, like you just sort of mark it as destroy, and all that sort of like logic to like add and remove stuff. It's just a little helper method that I've created here called link to add fields. And I'm not going to go through that, but if you're curious about that, there's some good stuff on like Railscasts or something like that about how to do that. And in Reform, what we do, so we create our object here, we create our collection called addresses, and we define all our properties. You'll notice that our destroy method is the virtual method. It's not going to save to the database anywhere, so we can just say virtual true, and that's all good. For our pre-populator, we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. We're just building a new address if it's blank. And for our populator, we're actually going to define a method for this. Like before we said populate if empty, and we just passed in the model. We're not going to do that here. And instead we're doing this method here. And this might look like a little intimidating or something, but it's actually pretty simple once you break it down. So there's a couple methods that Reform gives us called fragment and collection. So we define our address here. Collection is kind of the parent thing. So it's like all addresses essentially. The fragment is each individual address that you might save with. So each address will have an ID. So you go like, it's kind of like saying like addresses.find by address with this ID that you're passing in. And how that works is if it exists, we append the new address on top of there. If we see that destroy flag is set to 1, then we say addresses.delete that address. And we have this little like skip method that it's just sort of like return next if something, you know, it'll skip to the next one if once that's deleted. Then we just add in our validation. Again, very simple. We're just doing presence validation here. And that should work. So let's move on to the last form. And this one's kind of cool because, again, we're going back into company, like a model that we've already validated. But we're not validating on the model itself. We're just validating the form, like the user information. So that makes this really easy to do. And there's a nice way to do this here too. So we're going back to our flat model where we're just defining our attributes on our form here, on our view, I mean. And I'll walk you through this too. So in this example, we're defining the models that we're going to save to, like on our controller. So we're defining the company, we're defining the user, the account, like all the models that we're going to write to. And as you can see up here, we're just passing them all into this form object that we created. And in our form object here, we're going to include this method called composition. That's going to give us some pretty cool stuff. So how it works is you just define the model. Like this is this is the parent model company, and then all the properties that we're saving. And we just say like, where is this saving to? So, so for example, time zone is saving onto company. First name is saving onto user. ID. Oh yeah, and then for anything that might have a clash of names, so like we're saving all of the IDs for like user, account, company. We just call them something different, and we just say like from ID for the ones that we're calling something different. And we add in our validation, and that's it. That's all we have to do, and this form will just work really well. So it's kind of like a nice way if you have like lots of different data, you can just sort of pass it into your form object and go from there. So the advantages of this, there's lots. I would say they're model agnostic. Doesn't really care what your data is set up as. You can just take a form and choose and pick data from anywhere in your data model, and it doesn't really matter. And that's a really nice flexible thing. So validation is context specific. So again, I'm not writing any validation to the model at this point. We're strictly going and writing validation when the user submits data, and that's it. This keeps it restful. We're just having like a controller per a controller per form, and we're just like following the REST attributes, like just create, update, all that stuff. So, and these are really easy to test. How I would test these form objects is typically write, I guess now like a system test or an integration type test in Rails, and you can just run through your entire wizard, beginning to end, with just like one test if you want, and then you can test your validation with a very simple just object that just pushes stuff onto that form object and just says, hey, should I get an error if like this happens or whatever. So really simple, really nice. And they're just like easy to extend and modify. If you have to add or remove data to these, it's really trivial to do. And this was kind of like the thing that I really wanted for this last application that I built. It was kind of, the client was such that we didn't really have the specs really ahead of time. And it was one of those things that you're kind of building the form and it's like changing all the time. So I needed something that was like really flexible, and it served me pretty well, I would say, for that. And the nice other thing about this is you can just use them when you need to. You can use the default Rails forms when it makes sense to do so. And when you have something a little bit more complicated, a form object will help you immensely. But you don't have to have only form objects. You can just still use the same Rails stuff, and that's really nice. Before I end, actually, I just wanted to quickly say, like, maybe talk about the disadvantages a little bit. And for me, there's really only maybe one, and I think it's kind of like any time that you bring in any dependency into your code base, there's always like a learning curve to it. You guys understand form objects now, and you can go into your code and add this in, but maybe your colleagues might not understand it. And so there's always kind of like a little bit of learning and a risk of bringing in a new pattern or a new thing like that. And that's to me is like kind of the only disadvantage. But I would love to get your thoughts on that. Yeah, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks a lot for having me, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for coming. It's really good. Does anyone have questions?
I do.
All right, go for it.
All right, that was great. I was actually really excited to hear this talk because I just still in the middle of working on a project where I got to implement form objects for the first time. So it was really fun to see a totally someone else's solution. And so a couple things that I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on. I wasn't sure if it made sense to duplicate some of the validation on the active record models just for added security. Did you run into that yourself? Is that something you contemplated? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wouldn't say you should never write validation on your models. I think that'd be kind of silly and kind of crazy, you know. I think there's like a time and a place for it. I think if you're just feeding in most user data, like it's maybe not necessary. But if your company doesn't have a name and the whole application blows up, like, yeah, it probably makes sense to validate, to duplicate the validation both on the model and on the form object in that case. And there's some rare instances where you do have to kind of like get into the like if statements on validation, which I don't like to do, but it does happen. But ideally, you can avoid that if at all possible, you know.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, what I ended up doing was just like the basics, like just presence validations, anything that I felt was important. But it felt a little, I don't know. I didn't like duplicating, having that duplication between the two. So I still feel like it's maybe something I'd like to, like some kind of shared like mix in for common validations or something like that.
Yeah.
Share between the two. Anybody else have? I think I have just one more thing I was thinking of. All right, I guess I'll just so one problem I ran into was, and maybe you didn't run into it, but is when the form is really different for like the new action versus the edit action. So like there's a lot of like maybe fields that you're not going to allow to edit. Did you run into that at all? I wasn't sure how to handle that. I did. I had a form where you were only allowed to edit certain fields, but when you're creating, you can. So there's that. Is like that context, I guess, passing in context to the existing form and using one form, or creating two separate forms and inheriting from one kind of base form.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of thought when I heard that was like, yeah, maybe having separate forms. It's like, it's not ideal solution, but like you could, yeah, again, like just sort of either inherit from a base form, like you said, or use like a module or something to like share behavior between two. I've used like share behavior between form objects like quite a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know. Does anybody else have any ideas? I'm not sure about that one.
Are you just talking about the views? Like,
yeah, so like, yeah, so reusing, so like I have one particular form object where the new and the edit are kind of quite different, you know, where like certain fields aren't editable. And then there's actually another additional complexity to that is like, where do you store the logic that determines that, like what fields are. So I was just having to decide how to handle that that difference.
To me, that maybe sounds like, I could be wrong, but it maybe sounds like a separate form object. Like if the data is like wildly different, then it might just be like using a new object there.
Yeah, avoid making an abstraction that you don't necessarily need to make just yet.
Yeah. Sometimes
maybe,
duplication is better.
yeah, maybe just eat the little bit of the duplication that you're making, and sort of deal with that technical debt for a little bit. And then when you get to a point where you realize that, hey, you know what, this is a lot of duplication, and they could be the same object, or they could inherit from the same form object, then you would start planning for something like that. My personal opinion, honestly.
Yeah, that's kind of Sandy Metz's thing, is to like duplicate until you see the abstraction, and then once it becomes apparent, then like break it out, because it's hard to go the other way around. Like if you start abstracting weird things and creating all these modules, you create the wrong abstraction.
Yeah, I agree. I usually wait till about like 3 times it's like duplicating, and I'm like seeing the pattern. Then I'm like, okay, now I can extract this.
Yeah,
makes sense. Yeah.
it's kind of the way I think of it too. Like when you see the third one, then you're like, oh, okay, maybe I should break this out.
Yeah.
That's usually how I treat my React components. If I write a component, usually I'll write a new component every time. And if I get to a point where the component that I've made in the past are similar to the component I'm about to make, that's when I go into the previously made component and then extend it with more props or something. If I need, that's what I need.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for giving the talk. I appreciate it. That was really fun to see.
Thanks for the
Yeah,
talk.
thanks. I'm gonna have to reference that. Yeah.
Okay. Well.
Any other questions?
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Talk to you later.
All right. Bye, Andrew.